My name is Kristine Aquino, and I am a managing editor for Bloomberg News, and very, very honored to be delivering this panel with you, especially because I have such an esteemed lineup of panelists taking the stage with me to really talk about the central theme of this conference, right? Mastering the new economy. So allow me to introduce my amazing panelists, starting with Doris Meister, who is the chairman and CEO of Wilmington Trust Company, which is a leading provider of wealth and institutional services for M&T Bank, which is a top 15 U.S. bank. We also have Thomas Warsop, who is president and CEO of ACI Worldwide, which is one of the biggest providers of payment solutions worldwide. And of course, we also have Mr. Oliver Gilbert, who is the chairman of the board of county commissioners for Miami-Dade County. So I'm going to give everyone a chance to take the spotlight, but I want to do it through the lens of the opening question that I want to pose to each and every one of you, right? Which is, the panel is all about navigating the new economy. What does that really mean, right? What does the new economy mean to you, and how is it manifesting in your businesses and industries? Doris, how about we start with you?
Oh, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. We are certainly in a new environment and have been for a couple of years now, not only in terms of the economic environment and the capital markets environment, but I also think for all of us who are either in public policy or running businesses, we are in a very new era in terms of labor force and the impact of technology on the labor force. So whether you're an employer trying to figure out your talent strategy, or you're in the public arena trying to ensure that you have a high labor force participation rate and people are able to gain high, relatively livable wages in whatever work they're doing, it is a very challenging time. Lots of opportunity in terms of productivity gains through technologies like AI, which are unfolding now over the next 3 to 5 years, but also the potential for huge disruption.
Yeah, well, I just want to build on something that Doris just said. Talent is not just about talent. Talent, obviously, huge impacts of the changes that we've all seen over the last few years. But I'm the father of 2 millennial daughters. And when I think about the way they look at the world versus the way I did when I was their age, there's so many differences. It's almost like a completely different place. And so I think about that. They've never known inflation, actually, and now here we are. When you think about the businesses that they have joined, the jobs that they have now, both of them in different ways are their companies are shifting dramatically because money's been free for a long time. Debt was almost free. During the pandemic, tons of money flowed into the system from governments, and it's now suddenly they're thinking differently, and they're thinking, wow. First of all, they're on their own for the first time in their lives, and they're having to pay their own bills. Yeah. But then, oh my goodness, this is hard. And that's, it's people that are running companies like us, same thing, right? It was so cheap to borrow, and that was fueling this massive growth in asset values, in revenues, in spend, and that is starting to come to a screeching halt. So lots and lots of implications there, and I think that's really what we're here for.
What about you, Oliver?
First, let me just say good morning. Thank you all for having me. Thank you all for being here. I know you all were welcomed previously, I believe, by the mayor, but let me welcome you to Miami-Dade County. If ever you get tired of visiting Miami-Dade County, feel free to move here. Everyone else did. And so we're happy to have you. We're willing to make space. When you think about a new economy, I don't think of it as a new economy. I think of it as the next economy. And fundamentally, I think that's what we're learning right now. We're learning how it's going to teach us how to be flexible. So your daughters, they're millennials. They were born into a world that was relatively stagnant. There was new, we thought everything, we thought Uber and Uber Eats was revolutionary. It was really just an app. but it was the same car. What happens when you have urban air mobility? What happens when you start to transition from a fossil fuel to alternative sources? What happens when money and currency start to move differently? How do we do that? And it starts with our mindset. We have to become more flexible. We have to understand that whole is almost like a new world. It is actually a new world, and we have to find ways to make it smaller and bigger at the same time. Because we know that's where our growth is going to be. We have to find ways to incorporate people on varying levels. We have to find ways as government to not make no our default answer. We have to find ways and learn the lessons of COVID. COVID taught us some really important things. COVID taught us that people don't have to come into buildings to actually do work. And that was great in some respects, but now you have all of these buildings going empty. COVID also taught companies that you might not need as many people to work, and when you incorporate AI with that, now we know that people do have to have jobs. So, but all of that's going to start. We're going to address all of that by being flexible and having an imagination. One of the things that I like to focus on when I talk to people about is a lot of things that we believe to be set in stone, to be what I call a law of physics, isn't really a law of physics. It's a social construct. You know, I have this conversation when I talk to students at schools. I tell them, I say, my socks don't match. And I ask them, they say, well, your socks are supposed to match. And I say, well, why do socks have to match? What's the purpose of socks? And some kids will say something funny like, so your shoes don't stink. And others will say, because, you know, it's supposed to match with your outfit. And I say the purpose of socks is just to keep your feet warm. It doesn't matter if they look alike. The power of matching socks, it's a social construct. We give it power. What we make, we can remake, and we can remake again. That's the story of history. That's the story of tomorrow being undefeated. That's the story that we're becoming, that we're growing into.
All right,
I think you just covered the entire agenda.
Yeah, I was going to say, we have inflation, we have AI, we have socks. So
Movement of money. He covered it all.
exactly, yeah. The audience, you're in for a treat because, you know, this is just the beginning of this panel. But no, thank you so much for all of those opening statements. Again, you know, we'll cover so much ground here. But let me start actually, you know, with the inflation point, right? Because Tom brought that up. And I know one of your favorite topics, Tom, because I know you're an economist by training, right? So inflation, definitely fascinating, just the way that it has, you know, it manifested itself through society. It's something that you talk about around the dinner table now, just because it has very real consequences for real people. But it's been one of the biggest drivers of change since the pandemic. Talk to us about the way that inflation has impacted the movement of money across the world. Like, this is very much in your perch, right? How has that kind of changed that process?
Yeah, sure. So let me just kind of go back, and I bet you there are a few other people that are trained in economics in this room. So you may have a different opinion than I do, but I think about you know, as I said, my daughters have never really known inflation, and it's been so long since, especially in the United States, since we've had meaningful inflation that it came as quite a shock. And so obviously there's been a lot of dissecting of what happened. How did we get here? I think it's super simple, but the way out is really hard. Super simple because we all lived through it. The pandemic happens, supply gets slashed because everybody thought the world was coming to an end. So everybody stopped making things because they thought nobody was going to buy anything. And then a bunch of money got shoved into the market. And so now you have a very low supply and a high of ability to purchase. Doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out inflation is coming. So that's what happened. So now how do you fight that? You're the Federal Reserve. What do you do? Problem is, Fed has one tool, Fed funds rate. One tool. That's the wrong tool to fight a supply-based inflation. Because the problem is, you tighten, what happens? Investment comes down. Supply comes down. Okay, yeah, the availability of cash comes down, but is it coming fast enough? Well, you know, I mean, obviously it's moderating. But I think we're in for a pretty prolonged inflationary path. It's not going to be as high as it was, I don't think, for a year or two, but I think it's going to take a long time to get it back to that 2% target. And I don't even know if that's the right target. And so we need to start thinking differently. How do you thrive in an environment where inflation is a little higher than you're really comfortable with? How do you plan your personal budgets that way? I mean, and by the way, the other thing I would say is inflation, we have all these official measurements of inflation, but I actually don't think, I was thinking about it this morning. So I say, not this hotel. This is a very nice hotel, so you get lots of services here. But I stayed at a more of a business hotel last week in Omaha, Nebraska, and when I checked in, they said, let us know if you want housekeeping services. And it made me start to think, first of all, the room rate at that hotel has gone up a lot in the last 3 years. That's one issue. But now think about what you get for that money. In many ways, it's less. So if you think about the real inflation, what do you get for what you pay for? It's even a lot higher than what we're talking about. So we've got to all be prepared for that. And when I think about new economy, next economy, I think that's a great point. It's not necessarily new, but the next one, it's going to be different in a lot of ways. But I think we better get used to having more inflation than we're probably comfortable with.
Now, Doris, I'm sure this has real consequences as well for anyone who's trying to plan their wealth, do some financial planning, figure out how they're going to pass on their legacy to their children and whatnot. How have people kind of changed the way they think about wealth and wealth creation, given that inflation has some very dire consequences for anyone, particularly who has a fixed amount of wealth and potentially see that eroded over time?
Yeah, when we work with clients, we really work over the long term. So you typically want to have enough cash and liquid resources to get you through the short term, and then most clients have a longer term horizon. So to piggyback on what you said, Tom, we published, Wilmington Trust includes Wilmington Trust Investment Management with over $100 billion in assets that we manage, and we have a terrific team. They publish a capital markets forecast, which you can get online every December. Last year's, the title was Inflation. And in addition to what Tom mentioned in terms of the near-term pressures induced by the pandemic and the central bank's response, we also have 3 other major underlying structural problems that are going to cause, we believe, inflation to run higher over the next decade. And those are a big change in the labor force. We had 3 million people drop out of the labor force. You can see tightness in the labor supply and the labor numbers pretty much everywhere. The second factor is China. China was a major disinflationary force, providing huge amounts of labor and cheap goods for the prior decade. That posture has shifted pretty dramatically, in part because of supply chain problems, et cetera. So we don't think you can count on the same sort of labor force benefits, particularly now with the geopolitical problems we have. And then the third issue is energy. And we are pushing very much in response to climate change, more of a green approach to energy, but we don't have the infrastructure in place, nor will we most likely until 2030 to 2050. So 2030 to 2050. So the issue really becomes, how do we manage through all that? So we actually think over the next 10 years, we're going to have higher than average inflation. We think the Fed is most likely not to have a 2% goal, but to have something higher. And of course, our deficit and the quantitative easing that ballooned the Fed's balance sheet are going to be a constant problem, as Tom mentioned, as we try to react to inflation. So we're working with our clients to expect higher levels of interest rates over the coming 10 years, but also higher levels of inflation.
I'm curious, how has that gone down when you tell your clients expect higher levels of inflation and higher interest rates?
Oh, they believe it because I think, like you said, Tom, I have twin daughters who are turning 21 in February as well. Most families, we work with families, not really an individual client. And in those cases, what everyone's worried about is the children, the grandchildren, the future of the world. And so it's going over, I find people want to know the truth, and they are much happier if you break the bad news and sort of say, okay, this is a factor. We have to plan for it. Let's plan for it.
Now, Oliver, we were talking about this waiting in the wings, right? I mean, obviously, inflation, very real consequences as well for families, for consumers, as we've just talked about. And, people really notice this when they start noticing that things at Walmart cost more and their electricity costs more. But talk to me more about really how this has impacted consumers and households, and just from what you've seen in the communities that you oversee. Has this really kind of manifested itself? And what are kind of the concerns that have come up ever since we entered this new world of higher for longer inflation?
It has, but in very small ways that aggregate themselves to a big effect. And so you don't really notice it. You don't notice you're paying like $4.36 for a gallon of milk instead of $3.37 for a gallon of milk. You don't really notice that until you add up the milk and the bread and the cheese. And if you're vegan, all of their vegan stuff. And if you're not vegan, all of your meat stuff. And then your grocery bill is just a lot more. You don't notice the single thing. You notice the aggregate effect of combining those things. But I want to go back to something that was just said. It's interesting because I'm not an economist. They're brilliant. I already told them that they're going to do most of the technical talking on the panel. So you all please listen to them. They know a lot of stuff. But what she said was very interesting because as we think about transitioning to a green economy, we have to be ready sooner than later. There's no real way to do that. The private side will do that, but it's going to require a lot of government investment. We're going to need money to do it. People in positions like me are going to have to ask for and spend billions of dollars to build out the infrastructure. We're going to have to do that. When we do that, we're going to most likely get the money from the federal government, which probably means they should reset expectations for what inflation would look like. And it sounds bad, but in some ways, it just marks where we are and who we are meant to be. That there are times in our development as a country, our maturation and evolution as a world, our economies, that we've had generations that were groundbreakers, and we've had generations that were ribbon cutters, and then generations that were operators. So we might just be in one of those times where we're meant to build what's next. We have to build it. We have to actually build it. We have to build out the infrastructure that not your kids, your grandkids are going to find this normal. We have to build that. And when you see that type of situation, that type of environment in our country, it's always been a generation, it's always been the government who's kind of led the way. The private industry is joined in. But basically, we're going to set the stage to allow capitalism to flourish, but we have to spend the money. And so sometimes that's scary to people because we've gotten people in this mindset of thinking that you can have everything you want and not pay more for it. That is a lie. When I was mayor of Miami Gardens, I wouldn't let my residents, when they came to a budget workshop and they say, well, we want this, but we don't want to pay higher taxes. Well, listen, if you want it, you want to pay higher taxes. If you don't, that's fine. So we're not going to have a taxing workshop. We're going to have a services workshop. You tell me what you want. I'm going to tell you how much it costs. But we know that government's going to have to do something. We know that government's going to have to set the stage. We need to start speaking very honestly and transparently to that point, because it's all based on your expectations. Right now, we've said it and we've established an expectation that inflation should be wherever. It should be down here, and the interest rate should be right here, and debt should be free. That's the expectation. We're going to have to reestablish what those expectations are as we continue to try to build the next world, build the next economy. And it's not just going to be us. It's going to be us, all of us, everybody in this room, all the companies and countries that you represent. It's going to be all of us. It's our time to do that now.
Yeah, if I could just make a comment on that, I think absolutely right. And if I had to choose one word to describe the new economy, I'd probably choose choice. Because like I was saying before, my daughters, your daughters, all of our sons and daughters probably, or many of them, have grown up in a world where they didn't have to choose, right? They had what they needed. It was really cheap to borrow money to buy something if you couldn't really afford it. That's not true anymore. It's not going to be true. So you're going to have to make choices. And same is true for a public company CEO like me. Used to be borrowing money cost 1.8%, 2.2%. Now it's 8%. And now it's different. I have to decide, do we make that acquisition? Do we invest in our current infrastructure? Do we buy a company? Now we think even harder about doing that and make sure it's the right choice. So everybody's going to have to make these choices. And I think it's good, actually. I think it's quite healthy, but it's a big shift. And we have to all sort of open our eyes, realize that's the way it is. I think it goes to wealth management too, because you have to think about, as you said, the long term. And I think that's another thing. We're all, I think, thinking more about the long term, because when you compound inflation, when you compound the cost of debt over a long period of time, obviously, it really gets to be a big number.
It's very interesting. I think you all made really good points about choice and people really needing and appreciating having a reality check in this new normal that we're having to navigate. And I think one of the consequences of that, of course, is kind of this emergence of the democratization of information about personal finance and the various choices that people can make about their own money, as well as kind of information about companies that they would be interested in investing as a part of that process of generating wealth for themselves. So Doris, I put this question to you. What do you make of that resurgence of, or I guess emergence of more information available to consumers? I mean, we know about the you call them the FinTalk financial influencers, right? On various social media, or people kind of calling for how to generate your own side hustles. Very important in this very inflationary environment. People are feeling a little bit more scrimped in their budgets and needing to generate extra income. What do you make of that kind of revolution? And do you see it as a positive, or what are the potential pitfalls in this sort of environment?
Well, I think being able to search online and access a lot of sources and do homework and research is a positive thing. And I think technology has enabled us to add a whole dimension to our client interaction and client service. It's certainly helped on the transaction side, but I think it's very dangerous because, again, translating to the younger generation, there's a reason why the editor role exists. The editor role serves as sort of a quality control. And right now, there is no editor on the internet. So people are sourcing various sources. I mean, I don't know if any of you have seen Dumb Money, but it's certainly a great movie to go see. It's pretty funny, and it talks about the whole GameStop issue, which was really retail investors, people without any savings, who basically followed a guy on a chat who had taken a position in GameStop stock. He wasn't an amateur, but he wasn't a highly supported professional manager. So I really think that's one of the biggest dangers right now. Very few investors are do-it-myself. Most investors, certainly those with a more significant financial situation, more complicated. Maybe you finally have had a family and you've got a home and you've got to borrow and you're working and you want to save. Usually people in those categories, or even the uber wealthy, go to do it with me or do it for me. So I essentially think resources are good, and being knowledgeable and doing a lot of good research is a good thing, but you have to know who to listen to, and you have to know how to process the information you're getting, or you can end up with a hysterical result.
I agree with that completely, but I just want to add one thing. It's also unstoppable. So we should just wrap our minds around the fact that with if the innovation exists, eventually we will use it. If the technology exists, eventually we will adapt it. It is not stoppable. And so I think that GameStop was an interesting thing to watch and understand because it's actually necessary in some respects. People are going to have to learn the lesson that you can't just listen to any old wahoo who has a IG account or a Twitter account. You're going to have to learn that lesson. That's going to be a hard lesson to learn, but it's a lesson that needed to be learned. It's sad to say because, people did lose extraordinary amounts of money that they could not afford. But now that person and people know that I shouldn't invest that which I am not prepared to lose. So we know that the internet has done something extraordinary. It's given people access to not just listen and read, but to speak. And that your number of followers might not be based on how smart you are. But that's something that we have to get used to. That's something that we're going to have to adapt to. And it's going to require something that we don't like to talk about. Self-discipline and personal responsibility. You're going to have to discipline yourself and be responsible for the actions because you can choose to follow whoever you want to investments. You can do that. And if it works out, it works out. But if it doesn't, it doesn't. And it's going to be on you.
Yeah, hard lessons to be learned here, definitely. But yeah, I think part of this whole phenomenon of the democratization of financial information also, I think, comes with some consequences when it comes to how investors kind of think about where to put their money in, right? And they have issues that they care about as well. Thus, we've seen the growth of ESG as an investing philosophy. So, Tom, talk to me about that experience of having to now deal with investors who have become more vocal and more activist in the way that they approach dealing with the companies that they're interested in. And for a company that's so global such as yours, how do you navigate meeting those demands, and what are the challenges involved in that?
Yeah, I don't sleep much. That's really the answer. No. Yeah, it's complicated because my company has customers in 93 countries. So our software processes about $14 trillion of payments every single day. So we're pretty important to the global payments infrastructure. But when it comes to, so we think we're pretty smart. We think we've got good products. We understand the economies in various places around the world. But this question about ESG, look, you can't argue with the sort of core of ESG. It's, of course, we all want a healthy planet. We want to be inclusive. We want to have the right level of diversity. We want to make sure we're governing our companies and ourselves in the right way. Absolutely. The challenge, there's lots of challenges, but I think what we've seen is some very, very small shareholders at some big companies have been able to shift the agenda of the company dramatically. It's up to you to decide whether you think they shifted those agendas in a way that was good for the overall shareholders. I don't know. I'm not making a judgment about that. But what's complicated as a leader of a large global company, the definition of what's the right thing to do in any of those categories can vary wildly from country to country, from region to region, from industry to industry. And so we have to figure out, how do we understand the desires of our shareholders as a group? It's hard to do in any time, but it's particularly hard right now. And you just have to navigate it the best you can. And I think at the end of the day, the way I think about it is, I'm gonna listen to all of my shareholders. I'm gonna listen to my team, and then we're gonna make the decision we believe is in the best interests of the world and the best interests of our shareholders. I think that's all we can do.
Now, Oliver, I see some parallels here when it comes to, companies dealing with their investors. It sounds a lot like kind of governments also dealing with their constituents, right? Do you see any lessons here, any parallels that we can draw in terms of how companies can manage the varying demands of investors from the civil service life?
I mean, I would just, it's, there are parallels. It's not the same because, of course, my stockholders are the property owners and visitors in Miami-Dade County. And so my charge, your charge, you have a unique charge. So I've always thought it was interesting for companies because ultimately your charge is to maximize the profit for your shareholders. My charge is to create an environment where everyone has an opportunity, where people are safe, where the water is clean, where there's a housing market that allows for people to actually, live in the place where they work. My charge is different, and my incorporation papers, the Miami-Dade Charter, the Constitution of Florida, and the United States Constitution. So those are the guiding principles, the North Star by which, when I sit and I speak, I realize that I don't speak for me. I speak for 2.7 million people, because even though you're elected by district, you're elected to lead for all of them. And so I understand that. And it's an awesome responsibility that I take seriously every day. I think that one of the things that we struggle with in corporations and in government is big turns. So it's like a cruise ship. Our port here, our port director, you all give a round of applause for Heidi Webb from our Port Miami. I know they're one of the sponsors here. It's funny, you have these big cruise ships, and I guess the biggest cruise ship in the world is coming to Port Miami. Yes, this is a shameless plug. But it's coming, and it's interesting when a ship turns, they don't actually turn, they make course corrections. They do it very slowly, and there's something to be learned from that for governments and companies. Don't turn something really big on a dime. It typically flips over. That's what you don't want. And speaking that kind of patience and a kind of patient persistence into people's consciousness, like leveling that expectation for them. This is how we're going to do it. We're going to do it slowly, but ultimately we end up going this way. Right now we're heading this way. We're going to go this way, but we're going to do it slowly, so as not to be overly disruptive in the system. The question of change is something that we've always struggled with in government and in companies. The question of how we actually allow our values to be reflective in our policies and how we spend. Those are things that's not new. We all have the conversation now because of the internet, and everybody's more communicated. We're not all just reading 3 newspapers. So now we get to look at our phone and we get to know, oh, you know what? Everyone's having the same conversation. The conversations were being had before. It's just that we know that we're having the conversations now. We need to do a better job, and I say this in Miami-Dade County, but this goes for everybody, of setting that expectation, setting our goal as something that ultimately moves us forward as a community, but letting people know that we didn't get here overnight, so we ain't gonna change it overnight. Because it's that type of progress, that type of aggregated success that allows us to take the system that we have, make the system we want, and not break a whole bunch of stuff in between those 2 points.
Right, slow and steady wins the race then. I'm going to remember that next time I find myself having to captain a cruise ship. So thank you, Oliver. Well, we have a little bit of time left, and I also want to get into the discussion of talent, because I know that it's very important to our panelists here today, and a lot of kind of different aspects of that whole discussion. So let's get into it, shall we? And Doris, I'll put this question to you. In terms of kind of the progress that we've made, particularly in business and finance industries, right? When it comes to achieving more of a gender balanced sort of world in this industry. We've made a lot of progress, right? And that's been very positive to see. But where do you see it going from here? And what do you think is kind of the next goal that we should be looking towards now that we've made a bit more progress when it comes to achieving a little bit more balance between people working in this industry?
Well, I would say we've made progress certainly in the time I've been working, 30 years, but a little over 30 years. But we haven't made that much progress at the top. So it's still pretty lonely when you're a female CEO. There aren't a lot of us, whether it's public companies or within large businesses within a bigger company. And I frankly have daughters. So while I think the world has gotten better, and I think we're all working more together collectively to create more diverse environments, I still think we have a ways to go. And gender obviously is one area where I think the industry has made a lot more progress, certainly than it has in other diversity categories, which are equally important. So we have a pretty committed strategy to recruiting diverse talent. And obviously, one of the other big challenges is if people don't feel that they belong, if they're not included, then they leave. And so I think a lot of companies have done a better job attracting the talent, but not so much keeping the talent. So we've worked very hard on a lot of strategies that we've developed, but also best practices in the industry, like sponsorship programs, mentoring programs, special development programs. And I think what's also important, and I say this as a female leader, I think it's really important that the approach we take and the language we use is very balanced in how we do this. Because if we go too far off on a pendulum, you create a sense that that everyone doesn't belong. I think it's, when we were talking earlier about social media and a 24/7 news channel, when you were talking, Oliver, about things turning on a dime, I think we have always had pendulums swinging in popular opinion in the US. I think those swings are more immediate and bigger because of the 24/7 cable, news system, social media. So ideologies or beliefs take hold and then things get kind of out of whack. So while I think we have to be very purposeful and have intent around a truly diverse workforce, building that, sustaining it, developing it, we have to make sure that everyone feels included and everyone feels they belong.
Now, Tom, I know you have thoughts around talent as well in terms of attracting them and retaining them. Let's talk a little bit about kind of the shift that we've seen from pre-pandemic to post-pandemic, where people are demanding a lot more flexibility when it comes to the roles that they go for. And so, but now we're kind of also seeing some firms wanting to go back to the way we were, right? This demand for a return to 5 days in the office, as opposed to, what was it, the completely flexible arrangement that we had just a couple of years ago. Talk to me about how that whole dynamic is playing out in your industry. Is it possible to go back to the way we were, or do we just have to accept that it's different now?
There is no way to go back to the way it was before. I don't even spend 10 seconds thinking about it because it's never going to happen. I mean, you were talking about office buildings sitting empty or partially empty, and we haven't touched on this, but there's a big impact of the commercial real estate, whatever you want to call it. We are way over capacity in most MSAs in the United States and actually around the world. This is true, and I've had some of my customers in particular say, I'm forcing everybody to come back to the office. First, it was 2 days a week, and then it was 3 days a week, and they said, we're going to force everybody back 5 days a week. Well, I can't actually think of a company that's worked for. I'm sure there is an example, but I can't think of one because that isn't what our talent wants. Some people want to be in the office 5 days a week. Great. Some people want to be in the office 0 days a week. My view on that is if they are very productive and they are doing a great job, then they should have a lot of flexibility. Now, I do think it's absolutely critical to have places and times when you can bring people together so you get to know each other. and so that there's an opportunity for a deeper type of collaboration. So I think it's really important to give that option. But your question about can you go back to the way it was, the expectations around especially working in the office or remotely have changed fundamentally and forever. No way back.
Yeah.
What do you think, Oliver?
Yeah, it has changed. The talent is very interesting. And I'm thinking back to the conversations you all were talking about with your daughters. First, well, before I even get there, it's interesting. In County Hall, if any of you all have been to County Hall, there's a little area upstairs, and it's a food court. And the food court upstairs, they don't serve anything fancy. It's like it's like a burger and some fries, some chicken wings, and a salad. You can get a sodas, whatever. And so I was there on a Thursday, and I was working from the downtown office, and it was 3:30, and my staff, because they loved me so much, they booked appointments all the way through, so I hadn't eaten any lunch. And so I went upstairs. I said I left my office, went downstairs, then went back upstairs. I'm going to get some fries, and I realized they were closed. And so this is Government Center. And so I asked the building manager, "Hey, Danny, I need to know why they're closed. What does this look like? What does their contract look like? I need to know because I'm really hungry and I can get me some Uber Eats, but I just wanted to order fries here or something." But they were closed. And what he said was, well, people aren't back in a building in a way that allows them to support being open past, I think it's like 2:30, and not enough people are back at work. This was like 2 months ago. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we don't necessarily understand the effect of working from home that it's not specific to your business. So everyone thinks about it as, hey, are they productive for me? Even if you are productive for you, you're not leaving the house anymore. If you're not leaving the house anymore, and you're not coming to County Hall anymore, the people who work upstairs in that little restaurant, they're closing earlier, which is fine. They can close earlier, but the people who are working those shifts now don't have that money. There is an aggregated effect on our economy that it's not specific to the individual companies. So, and I just want to say one thing about talent. We need to, this young generation is, diversity is interesting. It'll be gender, it'll be race. I understand the importance of both. We have to find ways to have an intergenerational workforce, because how I see work is not the same as how the 21-year-old who works for me sees work. Or, there's someone who's slightly younger and they work to vacation. That's not how we were brought up.
Right.
That's not how we were brought up. I'm going to work, and everyone knows this. The port director, they all tell you, I'm going to wake up early. I'm going to get everything done. I'm going to stay up late. I'm going to get the work done. And so, but that's kind of how I was built. And maybe that's not the best way to be built, but that's how I am built. So now we have this workforce, and we have these, 2, 3, maybe 4 generations all in the same workforce, and we all see it differently. We all see it differently. And so finding a way to make productivity out of that is going to be our next, that's the master class that we need to be teaching.
Oliver, I think you touched on the impact on communities of people not returning to the office. I mean, I do think every business makes its own decision. I play a team sport, so we have to have people in the office together to serve our clients well. But if you look at New York City, where I'm based, the statistics just came out. About 61% of office space is being used. There's a huge problem with office real estate in New York. They're trying to go condo where they can. 66%, no, let me get this right. Foot traffic in New York City, in Manhattan, is 66% of what it was prior to the pandemic. And every street you walk on, little businesses that are either the delis or the dry cleaners or the bookstores have closed up shop. And these are people who own their own businesses. So I actually think return to office is kind of a community imperative. If you're in these urban centers or even towns or cities, it's a huge problem.
No, it is. And eventually, so we're property tax based government here in Miami-Dade County. Eventually, as these buildings sit empty, it starts to reflect on the value of the property. Eventually, it comes to the point where it affects the services that we can actually offer as a government without actually raising the millage rate. But we're not thinking about that when we're making these individual decisions. We ought to be thinking about that when we're making these individual decisions.
That's the new economy, everyone. So this is it. Get used to it and let's get ready to navigate it. But we're just about out of time though, but I want to thank each and every one of you, my panelists, and of course, our audience for very diligently listening. We didn't get to AI and SOX, unfortunately, but hopefully we had a very great discussion for all of you to come witness. So thank you so much for spending the time with us. And once again, to my panelists, Doris, Tom, and Oliver, thank you. And thank you, everyone.